Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Wicked Tales, the series where we talk about all the dark, twisted, and wicked tales in the world. I'm your host, Sarah. Today's story takes us to great old Akron, Ohio, where a very promising and loved teen gets caught up in her lies, and instead of coming clean, she decides to turn to murder. Akron, Ohio is a city located in the northeastern part of the state. It has a rich industrial history, most importantly in the rubber and tire manufacturing industry. That is why they are known as the rubber capital of the world. The city is situated in Summit County and is part of the larger Cleveland-Akron-Canton metropolitan area. Akron is home to about 190,000 residents as of a census in 2021. Now, our story begins around 1 p.m. March 3rd, 2020, when Akron police respond to a home in the 1900 block of Scudder Drive for a welfare check. When police arrived at the home, they found 50-year-old Brenda Powell lying on the floor, bleeding out from what appeared to be several wounds to the neck. Brenda was transported to the Cleveland Clinic where she later succumbed to her injuries. As police began to do their investigation and was wondering what exactly happened to Brenda, they first spoke to their 19-year-old daughter, Sydney Powell, who was the only person home at the time. Sydney at the time was extremely hysterical and told police that there was a noise in the home. Then her mother told her to run, and that's when she heard screaming. She then came back into the house and found her mother lying on the floor. The police noticed that Sydney had several injuries on her hands. After speaking with her, she was taken to the local hospital for treatment and later released. Now, if you're well known with what a welfare check is usually when someone of a loved one or even someone that works with another person calls 911 and says, hey, I haven't seen so-and-so in quite a long time. Can you please go check on them and make sure that they are okay? So it's kind of odd that of all things, a welfare check is called to the house when Sydney herself is home. Let's take a step back to December 2019, when Sydney Powell's lies started. Little did her parents know, but Sydney had been given notice that she was being suspended from Mount Union University, where she was currently a student. During the fall semester, Sydney failed 3 out of the 4 classes that she needed to keep her scholarship. If you're unfamiliar with a scholarship program, normally if you maintain good grades, you keep the scholarship that you have with the school. Whether that scholarship is in sports, music, there's several different scholarships that you can get. And with those scholarships, you do have to stay at a good standing with the school as well as keeping and maintaining good grades. Despite Sydney receiving a written expulsion notice, she continued to attend sorority meetings as well as her classes. This prompted Michelle Gaffney and John Frazier, both school officials, to meet with her personally to inform her that she needed to move out of her dorm and that her access key would be terminated. The school administrators said that Powell understood that she had to move out, but declined their help in discussing her suspension with her parents and told them that her parents were aware of her situation. It was after Powell's 3rd meeting with the school officials on February 24th that she did move out. Sydney's roommate, while at the university, said that in late February, Sydney told her she would be moving away from campus to, quote-unquote, take a break to figure things out. Even though Sydney had moved out of the dorm, she did not go back to her parents' home. Instead, she spent several days in a hotel where she paid cash to avoid her parents seeing it on her transactions. On February 25th, Brenda texted Sydney asking, "Why do I feel like you're scamming me? Just remember, you need the grades to keep your scholarship." Now, Sydney did reply, and as a girl who's about the same age as Sydney, I could imagine how she replied back to her mom was probably very, excuse my language, but very smart ass and very condescending and was just like, my grades are good, thank you very much. But as we know, Sydney's grades were not good, and she was failing, and she was sleeping in a hotel room without her parents knowing. So Sydney's roommate said the next time she saw her again was on March 2nd, 2020, a day before the brutal attack. The sorority that Sydney was in was having a bachelor viewing party, which is like the TV show, Bachelor, or well, yeah, it's called, or isn't there a Bachelorette, I think? I don't know. I don't watch that. I don't watch reality TV like that. But I know that a lot of people love those shows. I mean, even my mother is a huge reality TV show, like, junkie. She loves that, like, Desperate Housewives and all that. I personally am not into that. So I personally probably would not have went to my sorority's bachelor viewing party, but Sydney went, okay? The roommate observed nothing amiss and said that, testifying that Sydney was her normal bubbly self. She was just acting like she normally would. The roommate agreed that Sydney was spending more time alone, and she was definitely pretending that everything was normal. So obviously this roommate is more than just a roommate and is obviously friends with Sydney and is noticing that something's off with her. But I'm sure her friend did not realize that Sydney was going to take the matters that she did the next day. On March 3rd, her parents discovered the truth. When her father, Stephen Powell, wondered why the university had not withdrawn his tuition payment, he tried to log in to the portal to pay her well, technically, yeah, it is her tuition, but paid Sydney's tuition. Unfortunately, he couldn't get in and called the school, and the school informed him of what had happened. Mr. Powell said that he called his wife to handle the crisis with Sydney, since as a child life specialist for an Akron pediatric hospital, she was better skilled at dealing with such matters. Brenda was practiced at de-escalating traumatic emotional charged situations, and it appeared Sydney was not coping well. Later that day, the school received a call from Brenda Powell, wanting to discuss Sydney's suspension. School officials testified that Brenda appeared calm and did not appear to be in an argument with Sydney at the time. It did sound like Sydney did come home during the phone call, and soon after they greeted one another, the school officials did hear repeated thuds and screaming. The sounds were alarming, and both school officials testified that it sounded like an attack. Frazier testified that about a minute and a half after the ruckus, the call ended. He tried calling back, and on his third attempt, Sydney answered and pretended to be her mother. She hung up after they called her out, and they promptly called the police to the Powell home, which would be why the call is a welfare check and not just, hey, I think someone's being murdered. What happened to Brenda is absolutely heartbreaking. Sydney had overheard that her mother was speaking to the school officials, and instead of going out there and just having an adult argument with her mother, she decided to grab a cast iron skillet that was closest to her and began hitting her mother over the head repeatedly with it. After she realized that her mother was not dead, she then grabbed a knife and began to stab her mother a total of 23 times in the neck. Brenda endured a violent attack by her own daughter. Before the police could even arrive, Sydney had broke out a window in the back to stage a break-in. Even after being released from the hospital, Sydney was arrested. She was later granted bond on March 5th, 2020, and on April 20th, 2020, Sydney was indicted again on more charges and was set to stand trial. One thing to note is that Sydney's attorneys were still trying to get the insanity plea, but the following comments from an expert witness really sealed the deal on Sydney. Prosecutors called one witness in rebuttal, Dr. Sylvia Obradovich, a clinical psychologist, who said that she interviewed Sydney, diagnosed her with borderline personality traits and unspecified anxiety disorder. Obradovich said she did not use any of the tests administered by the defense experts to rule out malingering because they relied on self-reporting. Furthermore, she testified that such tests did not accurately reveal whether someone is insane at the time of the crime, because they were administered years later after the homicide. She also disagreed with the diagnosis that Powell was suffering from psychotic break due to schizophrenia. The best source of information for the insanity evaluation is what was said and felt at the time of the incident, said Obradovich. She said she took a different approach than others by explaining what she knew to be true and comparing it to Powell's statement and symptoms. It just didn't add up to schizophrenia, she said, noting that Powell reported that she began experiencing symptoms at the age of 11, which would make her case extremely rare. The psychologist said among women, symptoms of schizophrenia usually surface around mid to late 20s. She also noted that it would have also been rare of such symptoms to go unnoticed. When Obradovich was shown the video of Powell appearing to be catatonic lying on the driveway, she said that Powell was suffering from the shock after trauma of killing her mother. Catatonic is not something that one could slip in and out of. Rather, the condition usually lasts 24 hours to several days. Obradovich also disputed that Sydney had no motive to kill her mother, stating that Sydney was willing to kill her mother because she would do anything to keep from disappointing her. After the hearing and closing arguments were delivered, jurors deliberated for 15 minutes before recessing for the evening. Deliberation would last until September 20th. On September 28th, 2023, Sydney Powell was given what she's charged with. So Sydney Powell is charged with count 1, purposeful murder, count 2, felony murder, count 3, felonious assault, and count 4, tampering with evidence. She was found guilty on all 4 and was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for this brutal stabbing of her own mother. It's a very sad situation, and it seems that her parents were even willing to help her. Even after all the lying she had done, they still seemed like they were wanting to help her, and she seemed like a very promising young lady. But instead of just talking to her parents and being an adult about it, Sydney chose violence and chose to kill her mother. So now she'll rot away in a jail cell. It sucks, but it is the truth. I guess for now, she really is seeing the consequences due to her actions. Thank you so much for joining me today, Please follow. I put out a new video every week. This is something that I've been really looking at doing for a while. True crime has been such a huge part of my life since probably like 8th or 9th grade. So wanting to do this series has been super important to me. So if you decide to support me in this journey, I really appreciate it. Till next week. Thank you for listening.